There is a moment in life when the truth stops knocking gently and begins to push from the inside. A moment when the weight you've been carrying for years suddenly feels sharper, heavier, more impossible to ignore. You stand in the same place, surrounded by the same faces, repeating the same routines, yet something inside you is no longer cooperating. What once felt like loyalty now feels like resistance. What once felt like comfort now presses against your chest, like a quiet warning. You begin to sense that holding on is costing you more than letting go ever could. This shift doesn't arrive with chaos. It comes in silence, in the kind of subtle inner tremor that only consciousness can create. You feel it when your body tenses around a truth your mind refuses to name. You feel it when conversations drain you instead of nourish you. You feel it when your spirit stops responding to places, habits, and people who once defined you. It is the instant when attachment begins to taste like self-betrayal, and something deeper urges you to step back and question the life you've been protecting. As this awareness rises, you start noticing the difference between emotional comfort and emotional truth. Comfort asks you to stay the same so you can avoid discomfort. Truth asks you to grow even if it means disappointing the illusions you built around yourself. This is the beginning of consciousness, the first place where honesty becomes more important than belonging. It is here, in this quiet confrontation with yourself, that you understand letting go isn't an ending. It is a return to clarity, a return to integrity, a return to the self you abandoned to keep certain stories alive. You realize that every time you tightened your grip, something inside you dimmed. Every time you forced what no longer resonated, you stepped further away from your own evolution. Letting go becomes the first sign that you are listening to yourself again. And once that listening starts, life can no longer remain the same. The moment you begin to question what you're holding on to, an old fear rises to the surface. A fear taught long before you had the awareness to choose differently. You were conditioned to believe that letting go means losing, that release is a form of failure, that endings reflect something broken in you rather than something awakening. This conditioning runs deep, shaping the way you cling to connections, habits, identities, even pain. It convinces you that emptiness is dangerous and that absence is a threat. But the truth is far more liberating and far more confronting. Not everything you lose is meant to be kept. Loss is often misinterpreted because the mind equates familiarity with safety. Your nervous system remembers the emotional patterns you repeated, even the ones that harmed you. So when you attempt to step out of those cycles, your mind reacts as if you're stepping into danger. This is why releasing what no longer serves you feels like fear rather than freedom at first. You're not grieving the person or the situation itself. You are grieving the version of you that was shaped around it. Many of the things you hold on to were never chosen consciously. They were inherited, taught, modeled. You learned to hold on because you were afraid of the silence that follows release. You learned to tolerate heaviness because you thought endurance was proof of love. You learned to cling to identities because losing them felt like losing your place in the world. The mind protects what it knows, even when what it knows is the very thing keeping you small. But the deeper truth is that loss is not the enemy of growth. It is the doorway to it. Consciousness doesn't remove what you need. It removes what blocks your evolution. When you start awakening, you don't lose people, opportunities, or versions of yourself randomly. You lose whatever was built on your lack of awareness. You lose what cannot meet you at your new level of clarity. You lose what depends on the smaller version of you to survive. This is why letting go feels like fear at first but becomes relief over time. Because what you are actually releasing is misalignment. What you are truly losing is heaviness disguised as stability. And what you are stepping into is a life that reflects who you are now, not who you were when you first held on. This reframing becomes the foundation for everything that comes next. Because once you understand that loss is not punishment, you stop resisting the parts of life that are trying to guide you back to yourself. There comes a moment in your inner evolution when the life you built around old versions of yourself begins to feel too small. It happens quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a seam stretching before it tears. You look at the same routines, the same conversations, the same emotional patterns, and something inside you no longer resonates. It isn't rebellion. It isn't dissatisfaction. It's expansion. A subtle shift in consciousness that makes you aware of the limits you once accepted without question. Awakening doesn't begin with dramatic transformation. It begins with noticing. Noticing the way certain interactions drain your energy instead of grounding you. Noticing how familiar places feel heavier than they used to. Noticing when your spirit lifts in the presence of truth and collapses in the presence of habit. These signals arise long before your external life changes, long before you choose to release anything. Awareness always arrives first, preparing you for the evolution your mind hasn't agreed to yet. This is the first sign you're outgrowing something. The internal world moves before the external world shifts. Your emotions begin to resist what your logic still defends. Your intuition withdraws from what your loyalty still protects. Your consciousness steps forward while your identity clings to what it has always known. It creates a quiet tension, an inner pull toward something more, something clearer, something aligned. And that pull becomes impossible to ignore. What once fit you perfectly now feels constricting because you're no longer the person who created those attachments. You grew, quietly, steadily, invisibly, and the environments that once felt like home can no longer hold who you are becoming. This is why awakening feels disorienting at first. You're standing inside a life that still reflects your past, while your inner world is already shaped by your future. Awareness dissolves attachment naturally. You don't have to force yourself to let go. You simply can't stay emotionally connected to what no longer matches your frequency. This shift is not abandonment, it is resonance. It is the moment your soul outpaces your habits, demanding a life that honors your clarity rather than your conditioning. Awakening is not about rejecting your past. It is about recognizing that you were never meant to stay where your growth began. The person you are becoming requires different space, different truth, different nourishment. When you feel the first signs of outgrowing a chapter, it is not a warning. It is an invitation. There is a stage in every awakening where the world around you looks unchanged, yet something fundamental inside you is already shifted. You keep showing up, you keep engaging, you keep moving through the motions of your relationships and routines, but you're no longer connected in the way you once were. It is a strange, quiet unraveling. The relationship continues, yet the connection has already dissolved. Your body stays, your voice participates, but your spirit has stepped away. This is one of the most disorienting phases of letting go, because nothing external has happened yet. There was no argument, no betrayal, no dramatic breaking point. Instead, there was a slow erosion of resonance. A gradual recognition that the emotional contract you once honored no longer exists. You realize you're responding out of habit rather than truth. You are maintaining a dynamic that no longer reflects who you are, and your silence becomes the bridge between who you were and who you are becoming. You begin to sense this breakdown through micro moments. The moment a conversation feels repetitive instead of comforting. The moment you hear yourself agreeing to things your heart is no longer attached to. The moment you feel your energy withdrawing in spaces that once felt warm. These shifts are subtle but irreversible. Your consciousness has already moved forward, leaving behind the emotional version of you that held the relationship together. This inner disconnection often happens long before the outer separation because the body understands evolution faster than the mind. You feel tired around the person even though nothing happened. You feel misunderstood even when the words exchanged seem harmless. You feel a longing for depth that the dynamic cannot offer. It's not dissatisfaction, it's clarity. A clarity that illuminates the distance between who you were in the relationship and who you are now. This phase brings its own grief, not because something ended, but because something is ending without being spoken. You try to keep the connection alive out of nostalgia, fear, or guilt, yet every attempt feels heavier than the last. The emotional thread thins until it can no longer hold the weight of the relationship. When the connection ends inside you, no amount of effort can rebuild what consciousness has outgrown. This is the truth most people avoid. Letting go often begins long before the actual release. It starts with the quiet death of resonance, the fading of emotional alignment, the collapse of a role you can no longer play. And once that inner shift occurs, remaining becomes a form of self-betrayal. This is not a failure. It is the natural unfolding of awareness. When you reach the threshold between holding on and letting go, the fear that rises is rarely about the person, the place, or the situation itself. The real fear lives beneath the surface, woven into the identity you built around the attachment. What you're afraid to release is not them. It's who you believed you were with them. Letting go threatens the story you've been living in, and that story feels safer than stepping into the unknown, even when it's suffocating you. Attachment often disguises itself as love, loyalty, or responsibility, but its roots are far more intricate. You cling because you fear the emptiness that comes after release, the empty space where your old identity once lived. You fear the silence that follows, the silence where you're forced to hear your own truth. And you fear the freedom that comes next, the freedom that demands you decide who you are without the roles that once defined you. The shadow of attachment is not about losing a person. It's about losing the version of you who survived by needing them. The one who tolerated, compromised, chased, or minimized themselves in the name of connection. The one who believed that holding on was the only way to avoid being alone. Letting go threatens that identity, and the ego panics when it senses its own dismantling. You may think you're afraid of endings, but what you're truly afraid of is the collapse of the narrative you held for years. A narrative that told you your worth came from being chosen. A narrative that convinced you your purpose was to fix, heal, or save someone. A narrative that equated stability with staying, even when staying meant abandoning yourself. The deeper truth is that consciousness does not destroy what is real. It only reveals what is false. When you awaken, the identities you built from fear can no longer survive. You begin to see which attachments were formed through wounds rather than wisdom. You see where you mistook familiar pain for connection. You see where you held on not out of love, but out of habit, guilt, or fear of emptiness. And that emptiness you fear. It is not a void. It is space. A space where the next version of you is meant to emerge. A space where clarity can breathe. A space where the self you abandoned begins to return home. Letting go creates that space, even if the ego fights to keep it closed. So before you fear release, ask yourself, what identity am I trying to protect? What story am I afraid to rewrite? What version of myself am I grieving? Because once you answer those questions, you'll realize that the real loss was never the person you're letting go of. The real loss was abandoning yourself to hold on. There is a point in every inner transformation when letting go stops feeling like a choice and begins feeling like something your entire being is quietly insisting on. It's not a decision you make overnight. It's a process your biology, psychology, and spirit initiate long before your mind is willing to admit the truth. Release is not weakness. Release is intelligence. An intelligence woven through every layer of your existence, calling you forward even as the familiar pulls you back. Your body often knows the relationship has ended before you do. It tightens around certain conversations. It grows restless in the presence of dynamics that once felt warm. Your nervous system withdraws from interactions that require self-abandonment. This isn't avoidance, it's protection. When you evolve, your body refuses to remain in the same emotional frequency you once normalized. It signals discomfort where truth is missing. It signals fatigue where alignment has died. It signals peace only when you stop forcing what no longer resonates. Psychologically, letting go is the moment clarity outpaces fear. You begin to recognize patterns that once controlled you. You see through the roles you played to maintain harmony. You understand the cost of staying in spaces that require you to shrink. Awareness becomes a form of internal rebellion, refusing to tolerate the narratives that kept you small. With every realization, attachment weakens. Not because you wanted to detach, but because you can no longer unsee the truth. Spiritually, release is an invitation. Your consciousness expands beyond what your old identity can sustain. You start feeling the misalignment of environments that cannot hold your growth. You hear the quiet urge for honesty, integrity, authenticity, urges that drown out the fear of change. Your spirit begins to rise, and anything built on illusion begins to fall away. This isn't punishment, it's refinement. Your evolution demands that what was created from fear dissolves, so what is born from truth can take its place. Release happens when all three layers, body, mind, and spirit, agree that staying would cost you more than leaving. Letting go becomes the intelligent response to inner expansion. It is the merging of the physical, emotional, and spiritual self into a single truth. You can no longer remain in a place you've outgrown. This is why letting go feels both terrifying and relieving. Terrifying because the mind grieves the identity attached to the past, relieving because the soul recognizes the path unfolding, and somewhere beneath the noise of fear, clarity speaks. You are not breaking. You are aligning. When release comes, it is because something within you is ready to return to truth. And truth never asks you to hold what hurts. There is a moment in every awakening when letting go stops being about the bond you shared with someone and starts being about the story you built around them. The ego clings not to people, but to narratives. Narratives that give structure to your identity, meaning to your pain, and familiarity to your fear. When life pulls you toward consciousness, it isn't the connection that resists. It's the story you crafted to make sense of your role, your worth, your purpose, and your past. The ego is a storyteller that cannot exist without continuity. It holds fiercely to who you were because it believes consistency is safety. It convinces you that the identity you formed in survival must follow you into your healing. It tells you that if you release the narrative, you'll lose the certainty you've depended on. And so you cling, not to the relationship itself, but to the meaning you attach to it. You may have believed you were the caretaker, so you stayed even when caring became self-sacrifice. You may have believed you were the loyal one, so you tolerated what your spirit found impossible. You may have believed you were unworthy, so you accepted less than you needed. These roles, formed in the past, shaped the story you used to define who you were allowed to be. Letting go confronts these roles directly. It dismantles the script, leaving you face to face with a version of yourself untouched by fear or obligation. This is why letting go feels like death. It is the death of identity, not connection. It is the death of the role you performed to feel accepted. It is the death of the emotional choreography you repeated to feel safe. It is the death of the illusions that allowed you to survive environments unfit for your growth. When the ego begins to crack, the story collapses. And when the story collapses, the truth emerges. Truth doesn't need a script. Truth doesn't demand perfection. Truth doesn't seek approval. Truth asks only one thing, that you stop performing the person you used to be. And the moment you stop performing, the narrative built around your old identity dissolves. What remains is a self untouched by fear, unmanipulated by insecurity, unburdened by the past. Letting go is the ego's breaking point, not because it destroys you, but because it reveals you. It strips away what was built from wounds so you can live from awareness. It forces you to confront the possibility that the story you've been telling is far smaller than the life you are meant to live. This chapter of awakening is not about loss. It is about liberation from the identity that kept you bound to what you were never meant to stay connected to. When the story dies, consciousness begins. There comes a turning point in your awakening when the entire narrative around letting go shifts. The fear of losing someone begins to fade, and a deeper realization rises to the surface. The person you are reclaiming is yourself. The grief you felt wasn't about their absence. It was about the distance you created from your own truth to keep the connection alive. The pain wasn't caused by letting them go. It was caused by abandoning yourself to hold on. When consciousness begins to unfold, the axis of your emotional world rotates. You no longer measure your worth by who stays. You no longer interpret someone's presence as validation, nor their disappearance as rejection. Something inside you becomes still enough, clear enough, strong enough to see that your deepest loyalty was never meant to be external. It was meant to be inward. Letting go becomes less about release and more about return. A return to boundaries that honor your energy. A return to clarity that was once buried beneath attachment. A return to the emotional dignity you compromised while trying to be chosen. you begin to understand that every connection built on self-abandonment requires distance for your truth to breathe again. This reframing transforms the entire emotional experience. You stop asking, "Why did they leave?" and start asking, "Why did I leave myself to keep them?" You stop wondering what you did wrong and start recognizing the ways you silenced your intuition. You stop mourning the relationship and start mourning the parts of you that went unnoticed because you were too focused on maintaining the bond. As you return to yourself, the emptiness you feared becomes spaciousness. The silence you avoided becomes clarity. The loneliness you dreaded becomes presence. You feel yourself expanding into the very space you once tried to fill with others. And that expansion is proof that you were never losing. You were clearing room for the self you abandoned long ago. This shift also reveals the truth about the people you release. If they required your self-neglect to stay, then their presence was never aligned with your growth. If they only connected to the version of you shaped by fear or insecurity, then the relationship belonged to an identity that no longer exists. Letting them go is not punishment, it is a correction, a return to emotional equilibrium. Returning to yourself is the quiet revolution that changes everything. It restores the wholeness you forgot. It rebuilds the connection you lost with your own inner wisdom. And as this reconnection strengthens, you start making choices not from fear, but from awareness, not from longing, but from alignment. Letting go becomes the doorway back to yourself, and walking through it is the first act of true consciousness. When you finally loosen your grip on what no longer aligns with who you are becoming, something unexpected begins to unfold. The silence that once frightened you becomes the space where your healing breathes. The emptiness that felt unbearable becomes the room where your clarity expands. And the absence you mistook for loss reveals itself as the beginning of a new inner landscape. This is the new space, one that only appears when you stop holding on. At first, this space feels unfamiliar because it is free of the noise you once used to distract yourself. There is no emotional chaos to outrun, no roles to perform, no patterns to repeat. You stand in a place where nothing demands that you shrink or bend or disappear. Without the weight of misalignment, your inner world begins to recalibrate. You start noticing how much energy you regain when you are no longer negotiating your truth. You feel the ground beneath you stabilizing as you return to your own emotional center. You realize how much of your spirit was consumed by trying to keep something alive that had already ended inside you. When you stop holding on, the exhaustion lifts. The fog clears. The world becomes sharper, more honest, more spacious. In this new space, you also begin to experience relationships differently. You no longer feel drawn to dynamics shaped by rescuing, proving, or pleading. You stop feeling responsible for other people's emotional battles. Instead, you gravitate toward interactions that feel mutual, grounded, and clear. You recognize the difference between connection and attachment, between resonance and dependency, between nourishment and familiarity. New people enter your life who reflect the self you're becoming rather than the identity you outgrew. Conversations deepen. Presence matters more than intensity. Silence becomes a form of connection rather than distance. Your sense of belonging expands, not because others fill the space, but because you now inhabit it fully. This new space also reveals the truth about your path. The opportunities you once dismissed as unrealistic now feel possible. The dreams you once silenced begin to speak again. The inner voice you ignored becomes louder, guiding you with precision instead of fear. When you stop clinging to what isn't meant for you, life redirects you toward what is. This shift isn't about replacing what you let go of. It's about discovering who you are without the weight of the past. Your decisions become clearer because they're no longer filtered through scarcity. Your boundaries strengthen because they're aligned with your self-respect. Your intuition sharpens because it's no longer drowned by emotional noise. What happens when you stop holding on is simple. You return to flow. You return to truth. You return to the path that was waiting beneath the clutter of your attachments. Letting go does not create emptiness. It creates space. Space for the life you were meant to grow into. As you reach the final stage of this inner unfolding, a deeper truth reveals itself. one that dissolves the last traces of fear around letting go. Consciousness is not a force that comes to strip your life of people, memories, identities, or attachments. Consciousness is a cleansing wind. It does not take. It clears. It clears what was built on fear rather than truth. It clears what was sustained through self-abandonment. It clears what cannot remain aligned with the person you are becoming. And in doing so, it restores you to a life that reflects your inner evolution. When you look back on everything you've released, you begin to see the pattern. The things that fell away were not taken from you. They were lifted from you. The relationships that ended did not collapse because you failed. They dissolved because they were rooted in a version of you that no longer exists. The spaces that once felt like home were not stolen. You outgrew their walls. Consciousness did not break your life. It revealed the parts that were breaking you. Letting go becomes less frightening when you realize it is a refinement process, not a punishment. The universe is not interested in your suffering. It is interested in your alignment, so it removes what drains your spirit, even if your mind believes it needs it. It dissolves illusions you clung to out of fear. It shuts doors that would have kept you small. It silences dynamics that thrived on your silence. Consciousness clears because it knows what your soul is trying to grow into. And as this clearing occurs, something else becomes visible. The path that was hidden beneath your attachments. You begin to see the connections that nourish instead of deplete. You feel drawn to environments that respect your boundaries. You cultivate relationships where honesty replaces emotional performance. You discover identities that feel like home instead of armor. The clearing reveals the life your clarity deserves. In this truth, letting go stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like alignment. You no longer mourn what left. You honor what it taught you. You no longer chase what faded. You trust what remains. You no longer fear the emptiness. You embody the fullness that rises from within it. Consciousness teaches you that you were never meant to carry everything you once held tight. You were meant to evolve beyond it. And now, with your past released and your awareness steady, you stand in a life where every connection, every decision, every step reflects the person you chose to return to. Letting go was never the end. It was the clearing that made space for your becoming. If this message reached you at a time when something inside you is shifting, trust that it is not accidental. Your consciousness has been speaking to you in subtle ways, through discomfort, through clarity, through the quiet recognition that something no longer resonates with who you are becoming. You felt the weight of holding on. You felt the tension of resisting what your inner self already accepted. And you felt the truth rising, even when you tried to silence it. This journey is not about letting go to prove strength. It's about letting go to return to your natural state of awareness. A state where peace isn't negotiated, where boundaries aren't apologies, where your presence is not dimmed to make others comfortable. You're stepping into a chapter where alignment matters more than attachment, where truth matters more than habit, and where the connection you rebuild with yourself becomes the foundation for everything you allow into your life. If something in you recognizes this shift, if you feel a pull toward release, clarity, or inner freedom, share it. Not for validation, but for liberation. Naming your truth is an act of consciousness in itself. Tell me what your consciousness has asked you to release.